Hello, dear friends. My topic for today is Parshat Acharei Mot, and I'd like to talk about the haftora that wasn't. What do I mean by that? The official haftora for Acharei Mot is taken from Yechezkel, chapter 22, which talks about the sins of the city. And of course, the city is referring to Yerushalayim. But for some reason, we never, at least the Ashkenazim, we never read this haftorah. For instance, this year, in which Acharei Mot is the day after Pesach in Israel, we don't read this haftorah. We read the haftorah instead of the next week's parsha, Parshat Kedoshim, which is from Amos chapter 9. And outside of Israel, where of course Pesach falls on Shabbat, so they wouldn't have the regular haftorah, they also next week will read Halo Kivnei Kushim, which is from Amos chapter 9. And it seems that every year we have an excuse why not to read this parsha. This haftorah from the prophet Yechezkel. Why is that? Well, there is a precedent. There is another haftorah which is very much like this. And this is a haftorah which was supposed to be on Parshat Shmot. Parshat Shmot was supposed to be from Yechezkel chapter 16. But Ashkenazim never read the one from Yechezkel chapter 16 because it's also talking about the sins of Jerusalem, and they don't want to talk about that. This is based on the Talmud of Megillah. The Talmud of Megillah 25b says, Rabbi Lezer said, Ein maftirin b'hoda et Yerushalayim. We do not read the haftorah called Hodat Yerushalayim, which is Yechezkel chapter 16 for Parshat Shmot. And then the Talmud continues and says, Tanya, there's a baraita that tells us a story. Maaseh be'adam achad, there's a story about a certain fellow who was reading just above Rabbi Eliezer. I guess there must have been like a balcony of sorts. Hodat Yerushalayim Tovoteh, he was reading that haftorah. Maybe he was going over it before Shabbat. Probably it's Parshat Shmot. Amar lo, Rabbi Lezer said, until you check the abominations of Jerusalem, to avoid his abominations, check the abominations of your own mother. So it says they checked after him and they discovered the scandal in the family. What is this? What is it all about? So actually this Parshat Shmot, Ashkenazim never read Hodat Yerushalayim, and Sfardim never read Hodat Yerushalayim, all the Teimanim do. Even though the Rambam says the halacha follows the opinion against Rabbi Lezer. But both the Ashkenazim and Sfardim follow Rabbi Lezer, who do not read Hodat Yerushalayim, but the Teimanim who follow the Rambam normally, they do read Hodat Yerushalayim. I think it's the same thing here in Parshat Acharei Mot. In this case, though, the haftorah was not removed and something put in instead, but the haftorah remains, but we keep finding reasons why not to read it. There's certain things we don't want to talk about, and they're not pleasant, so we just skip them. So this is Acharei Mot, a very interesting story of an unusual haftorah. So that's the haftorah that wasn't. So what is the haftorah that is normally for this time? And this year too. It's taken from Amos chapter 9. And it says, Halo kivnei kushim atem li b'nei Israel. O children of Israel, you are like the Cushites, says God. Because Israel I took out of Egypt. And the Philistines, Plishtim, I took out of Kaftor, and Aram I took out of Kir. Well, most of the commentators understand it this way. Basically, Amos, who is a prophet for the southern kingdom in Judea, but he's talking for the northern and the southern kingdom. Amos sees the people of Israel as one, whether it's the northern tribes or the southern tribes, even after the split. So he is talking about the sins of the northern kingdom, but he talks in general. And basically, the gist of what he's saying is, don't think that you guys in the northern kingdom are so special because you're part of the people of Israel. Because just like I took Israel out of Egypt, I also took the Philistines out of Haftor, and I took the Arabians out of Kir. And as you know, there are no more Philistines, and there are no more Arabians. So that could happen to the northern kingdom too. That's the simple meaning of the verse. However, there's a bit of a problem to that meaning. One is, obviously, the way that God took us out of Egypt is very different for how he took the Philistines out of Haftor and the Arabians out of Kir. By the way, where is Haftor? Most people explain that Haftor is Crete. Many historians think that the Philistines came from the island of Crete, and they basically were invaders in the land of Canaan and eventually the land of Israel. And that's why they're called Plishtim. In Hebrew, Plisha means to be an invader. So they were invaders, they came from Crete. So the Plishtim, the Philistines, came out of Crete, and eventually they found their end, of course, later on in history, and the Arabians came out of Kir. So, but when the Jews came out of Egypt, it was very different. First of all, we went into Egypt as a tribe of 70 people. And when we came out of Egypt, it was a major sound and light show. God did the 10 plagues. And even though Moses didn't understand why we need 10, God said, I want all of Egypt to know that I am God. L'man yidu Mitzrayim ken yesh. Yidu Mitzrayim ken yesh. And then, of course, after coming out of Egypt, then you have the splitting of the Red Sea, another major supernatural event. So this is not a regular way. It's not like the Philistines and the Arabians that you could say God stands behind history, and therefore, despite the fact that you might not notice it, but God is the one who decides whether the Philistines will come out of Haftor and the Arabians out of Kir. Here it's quite obvious. What happened in the book of Exodus and Shemot is quite obvious that God miraculously takes the children of Israel out of Egypt. So what does it mean? Why is the prophet equating leaving Egypt to the Philistines leaving Haftor and the Arabians leaving Kir? And to make things more intriguing, this haftora is usually read around Passover time, Pesach. In fact, this year in Israel, it was exactly the day after Pesach, the day after Passover. Now, Passover is all about leaving Egypt and how important it is to talk about Egypt, etc. And we call it also the festival of freedom because we left Egypt and left slavery. And now you're reading a haftora that's basically saying, it's not that relevant, not that important. So what's going on? Why would the rabbi say to read specifically this chapter in Amos in the vicinity of Pesach? Isn't that odd? I think not. I think that this is an important message. The message is the reason and the goal of leaving Egypt was not just to be free. Yes, the Egypt story is man cherutenu. We are free from the bondings of Egypt. Yes, it is man cherutenu. We are free from enslavement to Egypt. And true, in human history, when slaves go free, that's a good thing. When people leave bondage, that is a good thing, not a question. But is that why God brought 10 plagues against Pharaoh and split the Red Sea and brought us to Sinai? Prophet saying, no, it's much more than that. When Moses goes to Pharaoh, he says, let shalach et ami v'yavduni b'midbar, let my people go and they shall serve me in the desert. And God says to Moses, when you leave Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain, the mountain of Horeb, mountain of Sinai. So that the exodus from Egypt was a means to an end. And the end is this relationship with God. Now let me go over the verse again to try to understand now the new meaning of the verse. Halo kivnei kushim atem li. You are like Cushites to me. By the way, what are Cushites? The country Cush, according to the Septuagint, is Ethiopia. According to historians in the Encyclopedia Judaica, Cush was a bordering country to Egypt on the Nile. So that would put in the southern part of Egypt, or possibly in the northern part of Sudan. And in antiquity, Egypt did conquer Cush. And who else is Cush? In the book of Breshit, in the book of Genesis, Cush is a grandson of Noah. Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Yefet. Ham has a few sons. One of them is called Cush. So the simple way of understanding, you're like Cushites, Israel, meaning it's true you're descended from Shet, from Seth, and descended from Abraham, but the truth is you're all sons of Noah, just like Cush. So don't see yourself as so special. That would continue, of course, the idea of the rest of it. By the way, Malbim has a great interpretation, which goes against everything I said until now. Malbim says, what do you mean you are like Cushites? Because the Cushites look different than the Egyptians, so they look unique. So Malbim says, well, you, children of Israel, you are unique to me. And how are you unique? Because Israel I took out of Egypt. And then Malbim says the rest is read with a question mark. Did I take the Philistines out of Haftora? Did I take the Arameans out of Kir? I didn't. It's the Jews who I took out of Egypt. But the Malbim understands this verse totally different than I explained it, than most of the commentaries explain. But most of the commentaries, like the Radak, David Kimchi of Italy, have a difficulty with this verse because they do see it the way I said it at the beginning, that it seems to be equating the people of Israel with the other nations. And therefore, it's exactly as I explained before. So the meaning of this verse is like this. Yes, Israel, if you are going to see leaving Egypt as just your freedom and the fact that you left enslavement and that God took you out from enslavement, then you're not any different than anybody else. Because it's happened before that other peoples left enslavement. It has happened before that other peoples became free. It's not unusual in the history of man. What's unusual is that God took you out of Egypt in order to give you his Torah at Sinai, in order to create a priestly nation, Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, and a sanctified nation, in order to create a bond between you and God, in order that you teach the world the message of the Torah, of ethics, of spirituality, of the meaning of life, of the value of life. These are the messages, these are the reasons for leaving Egypt. It's not just a festival of freedom. It's not just celebrating that we're not slaves anymore. It was God took you out to give you a certain responsibility to mankind. And if you do not fulfill that responsibility, so then how are you different from the other nations who also might have left other and found their freedoms for a while from other nations? So this is how I see the verse. Amos is saying, Northern Kingdom of Israel, remember, it's not just about freedom, because if it's just about freedom, I will have to punish you. But it's true, the Jews will never die. Atem b'nei Yaakov lo chlitem, says Isaiah. I, God, have never changed, and you, the sons of Jacob, will never disappear. So the Northern Kingdom might be punished, but there always will be people of Israel. And Hinei Yamim Ba'im, the time will come, V'shavti et shvut ami Yisrael, I will bring my people back to the land of Israel, continues Amos. And I will rebuild those cities, and I will let them replant their vineyards and drink from their grapes, and they shall eat from the fruit of it. And I will implant them again on their land, and they will not be exiled again from their land, which I given you. Thus says the Lord God. And he also says, in that day will I rebuild the falling sukkah of David, meaning the temple, and I shall mend the fences, and I shall rebuild the ruins, just like it was in antiquity. Amen. Amen.